So why don't we start with, who you are and what we're doing here?
So this is for a podcast. So for the podcast, I'm not going to use my real name because I need some protection for that. But I am going by the pseudonym called Dust. I'm using the podcast is named it's a silly name, but called Fairy Magic Dust Bomb. BALM.
Hmm.
So it's kind of silly, but it's like a mix of it's a mix of things. I have some journalistic interviews that are more like deep diving. Other interviews are more like political science, where I'll interview people on why they believe what they believe. Other interviews are more my own personal experience in talking about that, like or basically like one person shows. We have and I definitely want to do some art and culture. So this is kind of a mix of like the political science, with the topics of sex trade, abolition, and also like more arts and culture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's begin. I had the interview. Sorry. Okay, I had the privilege of seeing a stage reading of the abolition plays Head in the Game and The Intimacy Coordinator that was on YouTube for a limited time. The plays really got into the details of what prostitution is on an analytical level, as well as showing how women in the sex trade can themselves deeply internalize its logic. The owner of the Boxing Girl fighting ring believed that she was offering a more compassionate alternative to other fighting rings in Head in the Game. I personally had a hard time explaining people without direct experience with the sex trade about what it psychologically does to people's moral sense. I'd love to know what inspired you to not only write on the topic, but to take an analytic lens in deconstructing the power exchange of prostitution.
Well, hi, and let me just say I'm Carolyn Gage, and I'm a playwright, and I'm really happy to be interviewed by you. I appreciate the quality of your questions. The first play in the abolition plays is Head in the Game, and it was inspired by an interview I saw on the internet with the author Rachel Morin, who is a brilliantly eloquent anti-prostitution abolitionist, activist, and author. And I recommend everybody to read Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution by Rachel Morin. She was prostituted for 7 years from age 15 to 22. And this is the excerpt of the interview I heard with Rachel Morin that inspired the play. The interviewer said, "You describe it, prostitution, as a form of sexual abuse. Tell me why." And Rachel said, "Because unwanted sex is unwanted sex." Duh. The interviewer said, "Even if you're being paid for it." And Rachel said, "Oh, yes. Money doesn't have any kind of magical quality that can remove the feelings that you feel in yourself when you are having unwanted sex." And I always make the comparison, if I was to hand somebody 20 quid and give them a smack in the mouth, that wouldn't do anything to take the sting out of the slap. It's brilliant. And the interviewer said, and I suppose some people might say, well, there is a difference there in that a woman might offer herself for paid sex rather than offer herself for a slap in the mouth. Is there another side to that argument at all in your mind, Rachel? And Rachel said, well, no, because the funny part about it is receiving violence for money is part of prostitution. There's plenty of men out there who'd pay you to do exactly that. And this was from RTE's Morning Edition in 2013, Rachel's interview with Keelan Shanley. Her analogy was so brilliant, and I decided to build a one-act around that conceit of males buying access to women's body for boxing. Because obviously what's going on is not boxing. Just because the male is throwing punches as if he's boxing, the lack of freedom or reciprocality on the other part of the sparring partner make it clear she's in no way a sparring partner, in no way boxing, in no way recreating. And that is actually that what is going on in my play with the boxing girls is paid abuse. The men are paying to punch them. Only in a patriarchal culture would the activity resulting from paid access to a woman's body be given the same name as intimacy that is mutually welcomed and mutually reciprocated. Even outside of prostitution, sex has traditionally been defined by men from their perspective and serving their interests. Now, this is evident from the continued use of the word foreplay to describe activities that are overwhelmingly main events with regard to women's arousal and orgasm. The myth of the vaginal orgasm, there's another example. It still holds sway in a popular culture that routinely misapplies the word vagina to refer to the vulva, in effect, performing a linguistic clitorectomy. For millions of women, clitorectomy is literal. I want my audiences to consider why they would characterize prostitution as a selling of sex when only one person is desiring it. Desiring it. Yes, the other one is desiring money, but only one of them is going to be having a sexual experience. So that was where I started from with Head in the Game about the boxing girls. The second play, The Intimacy Coach, was inspired by an accidental posting I made on a Facebook page with a group of women and other members of underrepresented genders who all work in theater. And someone was posting something about how awesomely enlightened young women are today. And I actually, you know how Facebook is, and I'm almost 70. I was thinking I was on a group of older lesbians. So I just kind of knee-jerk typed in, except about prostitution and pornography. And as soon as I posted this, I realized, oh my God, no, I am on a Facebook page of really young women and other members of underrepresented genders, a lot of them who work in theater. And I thought, oh my God. And sure enough, and there's 30,000 members on this page. Within seconds, they all started to pile on. And so these awesomely enlightened young women were alternately patronizing and shaming me, accusing me of being out of touch. Did I realize that prostitution was legal in Australia today? Didn't I know it was oppressive of me to impose my puritanical religious standards on other people? Do I not understand how important prostitution is to people of color and how racist my position is? Within minutes, I mean, there were just dozens of posts. And I think the most generationally telling comment came from a young woman who actually admired my work. And she was kind of compassionately offering a misguided old lady, me, some career advice. She said, Carolyn, this is not a good look. So I took a day or two to let the pile-on play out, and then I responded with statistics, citations of writings by exited women, including first-person narratives about prostitution in Australia. I cited the work of a friend and a colleague, an exited Native woman who's doing incredible activism around the trafficking of women and girls, especially Indigenous, on the ships in the Great Lakes. I am pretty sure I referred them to the research foundation of Melissa Farley and to Rachel Morin's book. And I shared a very personal narrative regarding a prostituted woman who had been my roommate. She was disappeared/murdered. No one posted anything after this, a zero engagement. They called me out. I showed up, not a single apology for the pile-on of ageist assumptions and false accusations. And I'm thinking, hey, not a good look, Gen Z and alphas. So anyway, this lack of accountability kind of stuck in my craw. Now, one thing, this Facebook group is very enthusiastic about the new industry of intimacy coordinators in theater and film. And I'm enthusiastic about it also. I wish it had been around when I was starting out in theater. It's a job of the intimacy coordinator to ensure the safety and comfort of the actors who are being required to perform sexual or romantic scenes. And they do this by making sure that the actors are continually consenting to all of the scenes of intimacy, every gesture, every action, the lines of dialogue. All the scenes of intimacy are performed according to previously agreed on choreography, and these agreements are all put in writing. So these Facebook members are very clear about harassment, sexual abuse, and rape that happens in theater. They are the first to scream oppression in a scene that requires a kiss if there's not an intimacy coordinator on board. I mean, they are scrupulously aware of boundaries and legal rights in the arena of being paid performers in theater. But so here's my question, what about prostitution? The prostituted woman is clearly performing, as Rachel Morin has so brilliantly explained, the sex is not welcome. It's not desired by the prostituted woman. Obviously, she's performing. Often she is repelled by the John. Often she's numb with drugs or alcohol. She's obviously performing desire. What about her rights? And this massive disconnect in the minds of these awesomely enlightened young women disturbed me. It still disturbs me. So I wrote the intimacy coordinator to highlight that disconnect and that contradiction. What about hiring intimacy coordinators in brothels, where 70% of the women report being raped at least once a year? So that's the long story about the abolition plays. I also wrote them because we have 40 years of statistics on the harm of prostitution, and it has apparently not changed the culture here in the US. What's it going to take? I've always maintained that an ounce of culture is worth a pound of politic. These plays are 15 and 25 minutes. They're perfect for classrooms and conferences because they leave a lot of time for the audience to discuss and process the radical paradigm shifting that has just occurred. So that's where they came from.
When writing play of sex trade, do you find yourself writing for an audience who has direct experience or an audience without direct experience? In the abolition plays, Head in the Game and Intimacy Coordinator, it very much felt like this was content people with direct experience could deeply relate to, but also like something I could show people without such life history.
Well, I write for both. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to tell the truth about this horrendous oppression. I want to bear active witness to my friends and colleagues who are exited and who are activists. And as I said, I wanted to give activists cultural tools that can radically rearrange the furniture in the brains of my audience in terms of how they frame the issue. And live theater is incredibly powerful.
Okay. Do you incorporate Marxist analysis of the sex trade into your work/research? If so, what books/series do you recommend to others interested in the topic?
Well, if you mean, do I apply a Marxist model of workers controlling the means of distribution to prostitution? No, because I understand it to be paid abuse. If you mean, do I look at the oppression of women and the demographics of who's being trafficked and prostituted as an outcome of class oppression, then the answer is a qualified yes. It's not white, upper middle class women being exploited. Do I believe that prostitution will disappear if or when capitalism is overthrown? That's a favorite line. No. That reminds me of Students for a Democratic Society back in the 1960s when they were confronted on their misogyny and their anti-feminism. And they took a position, oh, well, you know, sexism is just some side effect of all these other real oppressions. This is a Marxist analysis, and that it would naturally disappear as socialism prevailed. Wisely, the women in SDS walked out the door, and lo and behold, many of those women were founding mothers of the women's liberation movement. Male sexual predation and sexual entitlements don't, in my mind, fit neatly into a Marxist framework. Women need to walk out of the left, walk out of liberal feminism, like our foremothers did, and for the same reason.
What is it like to produce stories about lesbian lives over the course of decades? Do you find that other audiences are receptive to your plays?
Oh my God, Ianka, I could write volumes on this subject. In a nutshell, the censorship and shunning/scapegoating have been consistent in my career across the decades. About every 10 years, there's a new excuse for why lesbian feminist work must not be allowed. But what has never changed is the essential whiteout of the work and the witch burning of those who, in the words of blacklisted playwright Lillian Hellman, cannot and will not cut our conscience to fit this year's fashions. And when my plays are done, regardless of venue, they have a long history of being very well received. My issues are never with the audiences. That's my wheelhouse. If my plays don't speak to an audience, that's my problem. It's my craft. My issues are with these gatekeepers. And that's going to take a strong and separate culture of lesbian theater. And I am so sorry we don't have that today. Lesbian theater is coming up through coalition theaters, queer theaters. Every now and then it's a little bit of a room off the big house of women's theater. But lesbian theater standing on its own hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and like as a younger person, they're definitely the culture of people who like, have this idea they're very fragile. They're like, oh, I can't handle a person who's not perfect in their eyes, which really, I think, harms any creativity or any research, because like people aren't perfect in general, and certainly not perfect toward, the people's standards.
It's true that.
Yeah. You explore the realities of women in the art world in Artisma and Hildegard. One saying that stood out to me was Hildegard's experience of spiritual abuse in a Christian mystic context. In the play, Hildegard was depicted as having rationalized the experience to herself, and Artismia advocates for her to understand what happened to her as torture. As someone who has been involved in spiritual art spaces, I have seen many women who use metaphysics and some form of psychotherapy to rationalize abuse they have been through. Can you say more your decision to include that part of Hildegard's history in the play? What would you like women who are currently rationalizing having been tortured or abused in a name or religion to know or reflect upon?
Thank you for these questions. They really go deep. They go to the heart of what I'm writing about, and that's rare for me in interviews. Well, religious abuse is traumatic, and all of us, not just the victims, need to be enormously more trauma literate in this culture. And hand in glove with that, also addiction literate. We are a culture of the walking wounded. There's a reason why the TV series The Walking Dead has made it to 11 seasons. We are living an analogous psychosocial reality. Victims find ingenious ways to protect ourselves from emotional overwhelm. And these syndromes, which would include denial, projection, amnesia, fusion with the perpetrator, dissociation, etc., these often can and have saved our sanity and our lives. And I respect that. I also submit that these are individual strategies that will not move us toward a feminist and child nurturant culture. So perhaps we can all study up more on trauma, locate ourselves on the various axes of survival strategies, and begin with baby steps to transition to healthier and more socially aware understandings of our situation, which will lead us to more informed responses. And I word it like this because emerging from trauma is a process. You don't just, slap someone upside the head and say, knock that off. That's old school. That won't serve you. It has served them. It may still be serving them. You need to have a whole data operating system in place before you take down the former system. It's very dangerous to unplug everything and just try to shift like that. And this is kind of a vague answer, but religious abuse is a really tricky thing. It's kind of like a tumor that's wrapped itself around the aorta. Religion is very entwined with authentic spirituality, and just ripping it out because one has a sudden realization about, oh, the patriarchy and this is a patriarchal religion. That's very, very dangerous. It's like, well, like I just said, it's like taking down the disk operating system of a computer before you've uploaded a new system. But I think it's important for victims of religious abuse to do a very thorough inventory of what was good, what was helpful, what was beautiful. And I think of the Catholic Church, which centers a woman, the figure of a woman, in a way that Protestant religions don't. It's Mary. I have met a lot of Catholic women who are basically doing forms of goddess worship through their Catholicism. Is that problematic? Yes, hugely. However, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you do the inventory of what's good, what's useful, what part of that religion is something you want to carry forward, and then look at what's toxic, what's deceptive. Well, Mary's pretty passive. That's where I would say that. What was predatory in their former religious experience. And then you make a very conscious choice about transferring the good into your new practices, new ethical philosophies, and then especially you try to locate new communities practicing these spiritualities. because the lack of accountability that I experienced with organized religion, I am still deprogramming from that with Al-Anon. I'm 27 years and counting, and I use very cautiously curated elements of Dianic Wicca, which is a kind of nature-based pagan slash goddess practice. So.
There has been a massive increase in interest in sex trade abolition due to quote unquote sex positivity, deeply hurting many young women of a generation. People are beginning to understand things such as BDSM, prostitution, etc., often sites of extreme violence. There is an increased awareness that prostitution is not trans liberation, but actually one of the most violent forms of oppression for trans and gender nonconforming people. There is an increase in people who formerly identified as queer questioning queer theory. Can you recommend some of your plays and publications for this new generation?
Well, all of my work attempts to reflect a very strong lesbian feminist perspective. My entire catalog of plays is online, and I have something like 90 plays and 9 collections of plays. And everything can be ordered with links from my website, Kindle, Amazon. You can get PDF downloads, paperbacks, ebooks. Many of my plays center lesbian butches and or survivors of sexual abuse. And there's 2 indexes on my website for these. One is titled The Butch Visibility Project. Just Google Butch Visibility Project and you'll land on it. The other is a special index for plays that deal with sexual violence against women and girls. And this is sorted into categories like incest, impact on intimacy, link between sexual abuse and suicide, and so on. And you can always email me with what you're looking for. I also have a book of daily meditations, which is titled Like There's No Tomorrow, Meditations for Women Leaving Patriarchy. And I have 4 volumes of sermons from the Lesbian Tent Revival, which I also sell those in audio format. More than 24 hours of lectures that are hilarious, searing, incisive, and so on. It's kind of difficult to describe the Lesbian Tent Revival, but it's a unique combination of comedy, deep feminist politic, communal ritual, and riotous high spirits. It's kind of intended to revive an old-time feral lesbian hilarity, feel-good sisterhood, dyke ferocity, and Amazonian truth-telling. I don't know if that answered your question, but it was a big plug for what I do.
You wrote a musical, Lesbian Sadomasochists versus Land Dykes, women who wanted the lesbian separatists back to the land movement. Firstly, that's amazing. Second, what inspired this idea and how has it been received by audiences?
Well, you're referring to the musical Women on the Land, and I wrote the book in lyrics, and it has never had any music attached to it. So I think it's a miracle that you read it. I worked really hard on it. I really like it. I wish I had the music, and I think it's a very solid show, and it's got good musical theater chops. But it's a show that puts lesbian separatism, practice and theory, front and center, and that has never historically been for the faint of heart. Yes, you can order it from my website, and I highly recommend it. And should someone who is a gifted writer of musical theater music be interested, hit me up, because it needs music.
What are your thoughts on the narrative that sadomasochists and pornographers won the lesbian wars, quote unquote?
Well, I'm going to answer, I can hardly answer it better than to quote the first woman to hold federal office in the United States and the only member of Congress to vote against war with Japan in 1941. So here is our lesbian foremother, Jeanette Rankin. A lot of people don't know she's lesbian. They need to know that. Jeanette Rankin, lesbian. She said, you can no more win a war than you can win an earthquake. And you're asking me, if these sadomasochists and the pornographers won the lesbian wars. You can't win a war any more than you can win an earthquake. We are going to continue to tell the truth of our experience, and we're going to continue to document the harm. In fact, we're doing that more and more. And when we do this, we're defending our homeland. And historically, invaders have trouble holding foreign lands. And when I see all the assaults on women, I hold that very close to my heart. When you cross into somebody else's territory, You fight with a different agenda, with a different motive than the people who are standing in their homelands and defending it to the death. So I take hope from that.
Right, because like I think a lot of people don't realize like how displacing it can be when like people decide that, oh, pornography is inherently okay and people can't ever, have a space without it. Like, it can be very difficult for like young women to be like, okay, I think pornography is either problematic or just like inherently harmful, to be able to create a space and go like, here's my space, I'll hold it. So like I think people don't really realize, that there are some people out there who, don't really care other people are doing their own thing, who are, pro porn, pro S&M. There's a lot of people who just like do not like the idea of even people who are against it personally having spaces without it, and how it's like really difficult to even be on like, dating sites as a young lesbian. Say, I am, I do not do S&M. If you say that, and you say I'm anti-porn, you'll get harassed.
Yeah, that we're in certainly a time and a place where bullying prevails, and the technology has facilitated that, and along with the anonymity that goes with it. Takes courage to live these days.
As someone in her mid-20s, currently witnessing how queer theory and sex positivity has utterly failed my generation, I have to ask, how does it feel to be right about so many things for so many decades? I can find very old plays of yours that read as though they could have been written this year.
Yes, I do love that. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Well, I just want to say I'm autistic, and autism certainly informs my answer to that question. Writing these plays is my area of special interest. I mean, they used to say, that autistic people would have obsessions. That is a neurotypical kind of slur. So the language today is that we have special interests, and writing lesbian plays is my special interest. It's an interest I developed with doll houses and dolls when I was very, very young, maybe 5. And if you know anything about the special interests of those of us on the spectrum, it means these are really wired in. Takiwatanga is the Maori word for autism, and it means in their own time and space. And I really love that definition of autism. That just kind of wipes the slate clean of all Western medicine. Autistic people live in our own time and space. And why isn't everybody else? Why doesn't everybody? These plays of mine constitute the world of my own time and space, and it's profoundly joyful for me when other people, through my plays, are actually able to enter my world, my time and space. I live in a fairly appalling state of isolation, as do many neurodivergent people in a neurotypical world. The wall between us becomes semi-permeable when my work is produced. So I don't think it's so much a matter of, yay, I'm right, or being right. It's about being validated. People come and they savor a little bit of the world that I'm in all the time, and they get it. And I look at them and we're able to communicate so much better than when I'm just always trying to speak neurotypical language, which I can't do anyway. Yeah, and like just the kinds of questions you're asking me, I feel like you're inviting yourself in. You're saying, I want to stand in your time and space during this interview. And I'm like, really? Because usually it's like, see if you can speak my language, And I really appreciate that you did that. These are really, these are questions that I love answering because you're asking to see the world I live in. And that's not accessible to most neurotypical people. So thank you.
What are you currently working on?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. It's a play called Star Pattern. And the context is the 1966 mass shooting at the University of Texas at Austin. But it's also about how do we face a situation over which we are completely powerless, where wanton destruction is ongoing, as it was in this tower shooting, as with our present climate catastrophe, ecosystem collapse, financial collapse. That's a tough question. And so far the answers have been, denial, dissociation, and distraction. That's what I see as the way that we're getting through this, and leaving the solution to those who are incentivized by the carnage. The sniper in Austin carried on his rampage for 90 minutes before he was killed. And part of that's because it was the first. The police didn't have long-range rifles. They didn't have any of those SWAT teams. There'd never been a shooting like this. So he carried on for 90 minutes before he was finally killed. And during that time, hundreds of students and townspeople stood on the periphery just outside his range of fire, helplessly watching. And one of the first victims was an 18-year-old woman, Claire Wilson, who was starting her 8th month of pregnancy. She was very, very visibly pregnant. And she lay wounded on this broiling hot pavement. It was 100 degrees. So the pavement was 127 degrees under the sniper's tower. And nobody had the courage to rescue her. And they could see that she was not dead. She was struggling. And then suddenly this young woman came running out of the crowd directly into the line of fire of the sniper, lay down next to Claire, and she kept Claire conscious and talking for about an hour until Claire was finally rescued. And Claire later attributed her survival to this woman's presence. Claire had been shot in the back with a long-range rifle, and she was bleeding out and very tempted to just close her eyes and go to sleep. Her partner was next to her dead. He died instantly. The baby, she could tell, was dead. And here's this amazing young woman, like, so what classes are you taking? And then they did a whole lot of, who do you know that I know? She just kept her talking. She kept her alert. She kept her present. So this woman was Rita Star Pattern. And in this metaphor for patriarchal hell, in the shadow of this phallic tower, pinned down by a deranged madman who had just murdered his wife and his mother, Rita kind of established a little feminist beachhead, if you want to use a war analogy. And Rita was a lesbian. She came out after this, and she initiated and sustained a stunning counter-narrative, an alternative paradigm, an alternative model of reality to a scenario of unimaginable terror and seemingly complete, nobody had any control over the situation. What Rita did, and she was a very young woman, was astounding. And so this play is a tribute to the courage of Rita and Claire. I'm putting that afternoon on the South Mall on the stage, and it's intended to offer encouragement to those of us who are feeling somewhat immobilized by the scope of devastation that all of us are facing in 2021.